This, of course, is our new series. Having completed our series on Acts, we're now starting a new series on the book of Judges. So let's read this. This is from verse 1 through to verse 36. After the death of Joshua, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, "Who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them?" The Lord said, "Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand." And Judah said to Simeon his brother, "Come up with me into the territory allotted to me, that we may fight against the Canaanites. And I likewise will go with you into the territory allotted to you." So Simeon went with him. Then Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they defeated 10,000 of them at Bezek. They found Adoni-Bezek at Bezek, and fought against him and defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Adoni-Bezek fled, but they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and his big toes. And Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes cut off used to pick up scraps under my table. As I have done, so God has repaid me. And they brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. And the men of Judah fought against Jerusalem and captured it, and struck it with the edge of the sword, and set the city on fire. And afterward the men of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites, who lived in the hill country, in the Negeb, and in the lowland. And Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. Now the name of Hebron was formerly Kiriath Arba. And they defeated Sheshai and Ahiman and Talmai. From there they went against the inhabitants of Debir. The name of Debir was formerly Kiriath Sepher. And Caleb said, "He who attacks Kiriath Sepher and captures it, I will give him Achsah, my daughter, as wife." And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, captured it. And he gave him Achsah, his daughter, as wife. When she came to him, she urged him to ask her father for a field. And she dismounted from a donkey. And Caleb said to her, "What do you want?" She said to him, "Give me a blessing. Since you have given me the land of the Negeb, give me also springs of water." And Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. And the descendants of the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up with the people of Judah from the city of Palms into the wilderness of Judah, which lies in the Negeb near Arad, and they went and settled with the people. And Judah went with Simeon his brother, and they defeated the Canaanites who inhabited Zephath, and devoted it to destruction. So the name of the city was called Hormah. Judah also captured Gaza with its territory, and Ashkelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. And the Lord was with Judah, and he took possession of the hill country, but he could not drive out the inhabitants of the plain, because they had chariots of iron. And Hebron was given to Caleb, as Moses had said, and he drove out from it the 3 sons of Anak. But the people of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the people of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. The house of Joseph also went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them, and the house of Joseph scouted out Bethel. Now the name of the city was formerly Luz. And the spies saw a man coming out of that city, and they said to him, "Please, show us the way into the city, and we will deal kindly with you." And he showed them the way into the city. And they struck the city with the edge of the sword, but they let the man and all his family go. And the man went to the land of the Hittites and built a city and called its name Luz. That is its name to this day. Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shean and its villages, or Tanakh and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Ablim and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages, for the Canaanites persisted in dwelling in that land. When Israel grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labour, but did not drive them out completely. And Ephraim did not drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer. So the Canaanites lived in Gezer among them. Zebulun did not drive out the inhabitants of Kitron, or the inhabitants of Nahalol. So the Canaanites lived among them, but became subject to forced labour. Asher did not drive out the inhabitants of Akko, or the inhabitants of Sidon, or of Aleb, or of Aksib, or of Helba, or of Aphik, or of Rehob. So the Asherites lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Naphtali did not drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh, or the inhabitants of Beth Aneth, so they lived among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land. Nevertheless, the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh and of Beth Aneth became subject to forced labour for them. The Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the plain. The Amorites persisted in dwelling in Mount Herez, in Ajalon, and in Shaalbim, but the hand of the house of Joseph rested heavily on them, and they became subject to forced labour. And the border of the Amorites ran from the ascent of Akrabim, from Selah and upward. Well, may God bless his word to us today as we become reaccustomed, I suppose, with the situation that the Israelites were facing after they had gone through the wilderness, and God prepared them. They entered into the promised land under Joshua, and they conquered some of the territory, and God gave them an allotment in this new promised land of Canaan. So last week was an introduction to this new series. So if you missed that, it'll be on the YouTube channel shortly, so you can catch up and get a feel for where we are. Today we'll jump into chapter 1 and we'll glean some of the main themes from it. But just to remind us, or for those who missed it last week, I think it's helpful to look at that timeline so that we understand the context, the time context that the book of Judges is set. So there's a timeline there for you to see. And if you start off by just thinking about Abraham, of course. So Abraham was the great patriarch whom God chose to make a nation from and to bring into the promised land. And so the calling of Abraham was around 2000 BC. And so that's like 4,000 years ago today, 2000 BC. His descendants, of course, what happens? They go into Egypt and they're enslaved after a while. And then God raises up Moses and brings them up out of Egypt, rather. And that happens in 1450 BC. And then we have the wandering through the desert for 40 years or so. And we have Joshua eventually leads the people of Israel into the promised land. Moses dies. He doesn't actually enter the promised land. It's Joshua who brings the people into the promised land. And that happens around 1400 BC. And that's the time of when the book of Judges is set, between when Joshua dies and when the first king of Israel are established, so with Saul and David and Solomon. Now Saul and the prophet Samuel, who helps to establish him there, that's around 1050 BC. So from 1400 BC, that was the promised land. We're talking about 350 years of when this book of the Judges is dealing with. So I hope that helps to give you an idea of the context of where we're up to. Now, as we begin reading the book of Judges, which we've just done, I hope that the first thing that you noticed is that there's no leader to take over from Joshua in the same way that Joshua took over from Moses. And you can see that in that first part, the Israelites are sort of floundering around a little bit, sort of wondering, so what do we do now? Because there's no Joshua, there's no leader to sort of tell them what to do and to lead them into the next part. And so what happens is that they ask the question, so who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites? They ask God this in verse 1. Now, it's worth pointing out that this is actually a good thing. It's a good thing that they're asking God. It's wisdom. Here at the beginning, the Israelites recognize that, yes, sure, there's no Joshua now, but there's always God. God's still with us. God started this whole thing off, right? He hasn't just abandoned them. He's there still. So we don't have a leader, so let's then talk to God. That's the right approach. And notice God responds, and they meet initially with success. But unfortunately, for some crazy reason, they don't keep doing this. Now, you might be wondering how the Israelites inquired of God when there was no Moses or Joshua to guide them. Anyone wondering about that? I mean, I did when I worked about this. I mean, it just says here that they asked God, and so you sort of wondered, did someone just go, hey, God, what do we do? Is that what happened? No. What most likely happened, you see, was that God had established a way through the high priest who wore a breastplate with 12 stones on it representing each tribe of Israel. And behind this breastplate, the priest carried 2 sticks, or perhaps it was 2 stones. One was white and the other was black, that would give like a yes or no answer to a specific question. And one of these was called the Urim, and the other was called the Thummim. So the Urim and the Thummim, these 2 stones or sticks, one white, one black, most likely. And what would happen if Israel was preparing for a battle, for example, they would ask the question, should we go up? And what they would do, they'd somehow shake or toss these sticks and stones, and if it turned up black, then that would be a no. Don't go, so they wouldn't go. But if it turned up white, then they'd proceed into battle with the knowledge that they were in the will of God. Now, this whole thing is first introduced in Exodus 28:30. If you want to look it up, I'll just read it here for you, where God tells Moses, also put the Urim and the Thummim in the breastplate, so they may be over Aaron's heart whenever he enters the presence of the Lord. Thus Aaron will always bear the means of making decisions for the Israel over his heart before the Lord. Now, this method to receive divine instructions seems to have faded away after the time of the kings. The last time it's actually recorded in the Bible is in Ezra 2:63. So it seems that this was a temporary means that God provided for Israel to be able to seek the Lord for some guidance. So that's how this thing sort of happened. Who didn't know about that? Who'd never heard of the Urim or the Thummim before? Anyone? Anyone? No, you all knew about it. Oh, well, I shouldn't have bothered, should I? I shouldn't have worried about it. I mean, for me, it was really good. I didn't understand it much, so it was good to go over it. Well, let me continue on then. Now, God had made it very clear before Moses had died, God went out of his way to let them know that Joshua was to be his replacement. If you look at Deuteronomy 31:4, it talks about that. But here, he didn't arrange anybody to take over. So we can safely say that it was by God's design that there was no replacement for Joshua here. Now, it begs the question, why? You would have thought he would have. Why didn't he prepare and have a successor to take over from Joshua, just like Joshua took over from Moses? Well, I think there's probably many reasons, but I sort of thought of 3 that I think are worthwhile considering. Firstly, God wanted to test Israel. God wanted to test them. We looked at this briefly last week, but if you quickly turn to Judges chapter 2, verses 20 to 22. Judges chapter 2, verses 20 to 22, God explicitly says that he wanted to test Israel regarding their ability to walk in the way of the Lord. So I'll just read it here. Judges 2, 20-22. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he said, because this people have transgressed my covenant that I commanded their fathers, and have not obeyed my voice, I will no longer drive out before them any of the nations that Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel by them, whether they will take care to walk in the way of the Lord as their fathers did or not. Now, by testing, it wasn't that God was just setting them up just to fail, or that he didn't know what the result would be. I mean, when you test something, like if you imagine before you sit down on a chair or something, you might just test it to make sure it's going to be able to hold your weight. So you're wanting to just see how strong this thing is, that it's going to be able to do the job. So this was actually about helping the Israelites themselves to realize that when they tried to do things in their own strength and just through the force of their will, independently from God and his leadership, they were unable to serve the Lord faithfully when they did that. And Joshua had actually told them as much in Joshua 24:19. People should never just casually assume that it's easy to serve God and walk in his ways without truly seeking God for guidance, for strength, through prayer, through worship, hearing the word of God. I mean, this is one of the reasons why we come to church, you see. This is what it means to take care to walk in the way of the Lord. It's true for them, and it's true for us today. We also are at war, as Paul highlights in Galatians 3:17, when he reminds us that the desire of the flesh are at war against the spirit. The desires of the spirit are against the flesh. These are opposed to one another to keep you from doing the things that you want to do. And if anyone thinks that they can win this battle between the spirit and the flesh without God, well, you will soon be tested to show that you can't. And I actually think that God teaches this lesson actually to every Christian that he disciples, because he is committed to growing us into maturity. And so God allowed the Israelites to try to do it without godly leadership, to show them how much they actually really needed it. And if you've tried to live the Christian life all by yourself, without the help of brothers and sisters, without the help of the Word of God, without the Spirit of God working in you, you will know it's a pretty tough road and full of disappointment. And the lesson then is to realize we need these things to be able to live and flourish. So there's one reason to test. The second reason why God didn't just continue with a new leader like Moses and Joshua was because, and this is really important, this is a big theme of the book, because he was developing the role and the identity of the coming Messiah. In Deuteronomy 18:15-8, Moses had already predicted that God would raise up amongst the Israelites themselves a prophet of a similar caliber to himself, to whom the people must listen. This prophet would speak God's words. He would know God face to face, which Moses was famous for. He would serve as a mediator between God and the people, like what Moses did. Notably, he would be an Israelite himself, and actually his tribe, which tribe he would actually come from, had been hinted at when Jacob, whose other name was Israel, Jacob had 12 sons, which became the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob prayed over his 12 sons just before he died in Genesis 49:8-12. And when Jacob comes to Judah, suddenly there's something prophetic that comes in. Jacob blesses his son Judah, establishing him as the leader among his brothers. Judah is depicted as a lion's cub, destined for victory over enemies, with the scepter and the ruler's staff not departing from him, pointing to a lasting kingdom, and that the king will come from the tribe of Judah. And it is the line, of course, from where the Messiah comes from. So the book of Judges, right from the beginning here, clearly has a godly king in mind, right from the start. And that is why Judah is introduced in verse 2 as the one to lead the attack against the Canaanites. Actually, God had foreshadowed the establishment of an Israelite king already. So back in Deuteronomy 17, 14 to 20, God actually tells you, when you go into the land and you decide you want to have a king, this is what your Israelite king must be like. He would know and keep the law of Moses. He would be faithful. He wouldn't get heaps of wives. Oops, who does that remind you of? He wouldn't get heaps of horses. He wouldn't lord it over his brother Israelites. He'd be humble. But the main thing is he would keep the laws of Moses and be faithful. And what was about to happen to the Israelites in the book of Judges was going to show them the need, how much they needed a real godly king. And thirdly, just as the first Joshua brought the Israelites into the promises of God and so set the scene for them to see God as their king, so it would be for the second Joshua. Who's the second Joshua? Well, the second Joshua is Jesus, because Jesus is just the Greek form of Joshua. Jesus' name was actually identical to the biblical Joshua. They had the same name, pronounced Yeshua in Hebrew. But Jesus and Joshua actually shared the same name. Jesus was the second Joshua because he also fulfilled God's promises for the people. He led the people to have the God's promises fulfilled. And once Jesus did that, no other leader or deliverer was required. So the first Joshua, if you like, is a type or a foreshadowing of the second Joshua, who needs no replacement. And so I think that's why another reason why this Joshua didn't get replaced, because the second Joshua would also do the job completely. Consequently, what happens now in Israel at this time is that Israel is soon organized around tribal lines. So you'll see in this reading, it talks a lot about the different tribes. It's not that there's a central authority, a central sort of prophet saying, right, do this. No, it's Judah, it's Simeon and the other tribes doing their thing. So it's organized around tribal lines rather than having a central government leader. All right. So, the tribes of Israel, they're settling into their land allotments, making effort to fully take over their new territory. There is still a lot of land to be taken, and lots of Canaanites are still living in these areas. Now, there's a couple of interesting stories here, which I'll only just touch on because we need to get to the other main theme. And the first story we come across is this story of Adonai Bezek. Adonai, of course, means Lord or King. So this is the king of Bezek, which was like a city. So he was like the king of the city of Bezek. And we find out that this is one of the early campaigns that the tribes of Judah and Simeon embarked on, and they were successful, as the Lord said that they would be. We find out that Adonai Bezek is not a nice king. He's not the kind of king that Israel should follow. So we're already finding out that these Canaanites are nasty types. And this guy, the king of Bezek, he's dealt brutally in the past with 70 of his enemies. and he now recognises that God has justly dealt with him in verse 7. So what did he do? He cut off the thumbs and the big toes of 70 other kings that he had defeated. And not just that, he made them scramble and cramble around the base of his table like pets or something, you know. So he humiliated them further. Now, I should say that this is just a small indication that the book of Judges is it's macabre. There's a little bit of gore and some nasty thing that's going to happen. This is very relaxed, but it gives you an idea. Of course, this practice of cutting off the thumbs and the big toes actually had a practical purpose, because what it meant was that these kings could no longer handle a weapon, and they couldn't properly stand and move about in battle anymore. So they'd been really relegated to being irrelevant when it came to battle. So that was the reason why that sort of thing did it. But of course, it's a pretty brutal thing to have to go through. But here's the thing to note. This is the right pattern. God's pattern. That God's people is visiting justice on the evil inhabitants who are ripe for judgment, and they know it. Adonai-Bezek admits, God's repaying me for what I did, and that's just fair enough. Now, the second story is important because it actually introduces the person who will eventually become our first judge. And his name is Othniel. Now, Caleb, you might remember Caleb. He was, along with Joshua, one of those two faithful spies that went in to explore the land of Canaan. You remember the story? 12 went in. They all said that Canaan was beautiful and they had like amazing fruit. But the people there were so big and strong, and 10 of the spies just said, oh, we can't do this. These guys are so much bigger and we're like grasshoppers in their eyes. But Caleb and Joshua says, yes, we can do it, because God is on our side, right? These guys are nothing compared to being God on our side. So Caleb was one of those faithful spies. So there's still this connection, if you like, with that generation that went through and had been faithful. So here's Caleb, here in his old age, taking hold of his inheritance in Hebron in verse 12. We'll just get down to verse 12 so you can see that. So here's Caleb taking hold of his inheritance. He offers his daughter Achsah in marriage to any worthy man who captures the town of Kiriath Sefer. And who is it? It's Othniel who does it in verse 13. And he happens to be Caleb's younger brother. So Othniel is shown to be a great warrior. He comes from a godly line of good men, Caleb being one of the faithful spies. And so he'll later be a good choice for a judge. Well, I just want to leave these little stories now and just move on to what really is the other main theme before we need to wrap up this morning. And in this chapter, what dominates it is that the tribes of Israel failed to drive out the evil Canaanites before them, which God had explicitly told them to do. And I want you to turn to this so you can see it for yourself. Please turn to Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 16 to 18. So just a couple of verses. Turn to Deuteronomy 20, verses 16 to 18. And it's interesting here because in the first part of chapter 20 here, God is telling Joshua and the Israelites, as you'll make your way towards the promised land, you'll come across different cities and stuff. Treat them kindly. Offer them peace. If they offer you peace, then, let them live, no worries. If they fight you, well, you can fight them, but don't kill everybody, just kill the men. But, the women and children don't have to die. And see, he's actually quite, gentle and reasonable with them. But he makes a distinguishment between those people and the people who are actually living in Canaan, the guys that you're going to take possession of. So listen to this. Deuteronomy 20:16-18. But in the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, so these ones, you shall save alive nothing that breathes, but you shall devote them to complete destruction. And he gets specific. The Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded. I heard somebody say, and maybe even the termites. That's a bad joke. That they might not, here's the reason. Why is he being so brutal? That they may not teach you to do according to all their abominable practices that they have done for their gods, and so you sin against the Lord your God. So this is serious. These guys, they've been sinning their heads off, doing some awful things, really awful things. God is judging them. They're not to live. But instead, chapter 1 gives a long list of Canaanite groups, those ones even that are in this passage, and the towns that Israel just failed to drive out from the land. The whole point of driving out the Canaanites was to avoid their moral corruption and their way of worshipping the gods through evils like child sacrifice and sexual perversion. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine a group of people who, as part of their worship to their God, sacrifice their children and get into all sorts of sexual perversion and call this worship? Human sacrifices, unfortunately, were very common amongst the practice of the Canaanite religion. So they were told, Israel was told, to eradicate them. God had called Israel rather to be different, to be a holy people, distinct from this evil. But we see even when it came to Jerusalem, have a look at verse 21 in our passage. Verse 21, Jerusalem, the holy city, right? So here we are. The Israelites have come in. They've taken hold of Jerusalem. And what happens? In verse 21, they did not drive them out, but they rather lived with them. They lived with them. 21, but the people of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the people of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. It's asking for trouble, isn't it? It's asking for trouble. Ignoring the command of God, who told them to get rid of them all. Instead, they put up with them. As we've just read about the Jebusites in Jerusalem, they moved in next to them. And you know what happened? Eventually, they became exactly like them. You couldn't tell the Israelites apart from the Canaanites. This was one of the root causes of Israel's apostasy and troubles. That's what happened. See, the Canaanites didn't get influenced by the Israelites. They were too far gone. The Israelites rather got influenced by the Canaanites, and they were dragged down to their level. And there follows a series of 6 reports from verse 27 through to verse 36 of how the different tribes failed to carry out their God-given task of eradicating the Canaanites, preferring to enjoy the new standard of living these new conquered territories gave them. They'd seen these wonderful fruit and all these big buildings. Remember, they'd been walking through the wilderness and everything, and suddenly they've got access to all these buildings and everything. They seem to be happy to enjoy this new standard of living rather than getting on with the God-given task that God had given them. Just glance down at these verses with me. Verse 27, Manasseh failed. He didn't drive out the inhabitants of all these villages. Ephraim, these are all, of course, tribes of Israel, the 12 tribes. Ephraim fails in verse 29. The Canaanites in Gezer. Zebulun in verse 30 fails. Not driving out the Canaanites, but so they lived among them. Yes, they used them for forced labour, But God didn't tell them to use them for forced labour. He said they had to be eradicated. Asher in verse 31 did not drive out the inhabitants. Naphtali in verse 33 did not drive out the inhabitants, and they lived among the Canaanites. Dan in verse 34, they didn't succeed either. Now there's a lesson here for us to remember, and that is that who we hang around with will actually influence us. The phrase that I once heard, and I've told you this before, but it's worth reminding: you become what you behold. If you hang around bad company, or you soak yourself with most of the rubbish that's produced these days by Hollywood, or if you soak yourself in what masquerades as truth through all these different podcasts and things all over the internet and the social media, it will drag you down. That's why church and good Christian friends are actually vital, because it's war out there. I can tell you, after 35 years of being a Christian, we are so easily influenced by what surrounds us. Now, I don't mean that we should build huge walls and set up a monastery and hide behind it and separate ourselves completely from the world out there. That's not what God wants. But what I'm saying is like what God told the Israelites here, that what we need to do is be faithful to what is the core of your life, what your identity is. Who are you? You're part of the people of God. You're someone who Jesus died for and whose Spirit pursued you so that you could be changed from your lowly state before with no hope to be given a hope and a future in Christ. You're a different person. You were born again. Talking about the little baby being born. You've been born again. We're disciples of Christ. So that's why we soak ourselves regularly, rather, in the things of God. We need the things of God to rub off on us, to come inside of us. We need to be encouraged. I need to be encouraged by you. You need to be encouraged by me. We need our brothers and sisters. Rather, we need to avoid exposing ourselves to things that we know don't do us good. I can tell you, there are things that I have seen that I wish I could unsee. I was stupid. I looked at things that I shouldn't have looked at. I wish I could just unsee it. You know, you see things like that and you just get this sick feeling in your stomach that this thing is ugly and evil and does damage to your spirit. This was a bad move. Rather, what we should do is what Paul told us to do in Philippians 4:8. Whatever is true, whatever is honourable, whatever is just and pure, whatever is lovely and commendable, if there's any excellence or anything worthy of praise, let's think about those things. They do us good. They give us life to our spirit. We need to remember that God gives his people guidance and instruction through his word for a reason. It's not just to steal away your fun and independence. They're to promote life and prosperity and success, to mature us into healthy, wise, and solid people of God. You see, we all have Canaanites in our life, so to speak, to conquer. Not necessarily people, though there may be. But actually, it's more like the ideas that we encounter in daily life, trying to convert us to think like them rather than thinking like God. These threaten to intimidate and manipulate us into becoming people that we're not meant to be, and nor do we want to be. I don't want to be like that. I often say that to myself when I do something stupid. I say, I don't want to be that person. I'm not that person. I'm not going to be like that. So we need to fight against them. And we need to follow through with our commitment, don't we? We mustn't just go only halfway with God and then relax like this generation of Israelites did. They only went so far and thought, it's okay. You guys can hang around. Yeah, you guys can hang around. We'll coexist. No. I'm telling you, there is stuff that you cannot coexist with. It will pull you down. May God help us, and I'll close with this. May God help us, and we also help each other to become conquerors rather than compromisers in our own generation today.